Hamas releases 2 Americans it held captive in Gaza. Jerusalem, Hamas released 2 American hostages on Friday, U.S. and Israeli officials said, the first of the at least 200 captives the militant group has held since it rampaged through Israeli towns 2 weeks ago. The mother and daughter, released to the Red Cross in Gaza, were transferred to an Israeli military team and escorted to an army base in Israel to be reunited with their family members, officials said. The pair, identified as Judith Ronan and her teenage daughter, Natalie Ronan, of Evanston, Illinois, were in Israel to visit family when they were kidnapped from Nahal Oz, a kibbutz not far from the border fence breached by Hamas fighters. The group said it released them at the request of Qatari mediators for humanitarian reasons. Until Friday, Hamas had ignored demands from Israel and pleas from Western governments to free the captives, many of whom are children, ill or elderly. Israel has said it would not allow humanitarian aid to enter Gaza through its territory until the hostages were freed. Human rights groups have said taking civilian hostages is an unambiguous war crime. President Biden has called Hamas actions pure evil. Hamas said it was attempting to undercut Biden's portrayal of the group as a depraved terrorist organization, a characterization the president reiterated less than 24 hours earlier in a speech calling for more support to Israel. Biden, who asked Congress on Friday to authorize a sweeping aid package for Israel, said U.S. officials and their allies were working around the clock to free American citizens who were taken hostage by Hamas. He pledged to continue pushing for the release of all still being held. Our fellow citizens have endured a terrible ordeal these past 14 days, and I am overjoyed that they will soon be reunited with their family, who has been racked with fear, Biden said in a statement. Conditions on both sides of Gaza's heavily controlled border continue to deteriorate. Inside the Palestinian enclave, a humanitarian catastrophe was unfolding. Nearly 2 million people have been cut off from food, water, fuel and medicine as they weather a relentless Israeli bombing campaign. Hospitals faced with dire shortages were on the brink of collapse, the United Nations reported. Outside Gaza, international frustration mounted as an aid convoy remained stalled at the Rafah gate between Egypt and the territory. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres described a maddening scene of trucks piled with desperately needed supplies unable to reach their destination as officials haggled over logistics. It is impossible to be here and not to feel a broken heart, Guterres said during his brief visit. Biden, who said this week that Israel and Egypt had assured him they would allow the aid trucks to pass, announced Friday that the crossing would open in the next 24 to 48 hours. Elsewhere along the border, the Israeli military was massing troops and armored vehicles in preparation for the anticipated ground invasion of the densely populated territory. The operation would involve heavy urban combat and almost certainly would lead to an escalation in civilian casualties, analysts said. As Israel prepared for a ground war, and besieged bystanders braced for its likely consequences, Amnesty International said it had found damning evidence of Israeli war crimes in Gaza. Amnesty investigators said Israeli attacks have destroyed block after block of residential buildings and critical infrastructure and caused mass civilian casualties. In their stated intent to use all means to destroy Hamas, Israeli forces have shown a shocking disregard for civilian lives, said Agnes Callamard, the Secretary-General of the London-based rights group. Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, spokesman for the Israeli Defense Force, said aircraft were bombing Gaza at a rate not seen for decades. Military officials said they were preparing their next stage of operations against Hamas. The prospect of increased violence and the hamstrung aid continued to spur widespread protests in the Middle East and beyond. From Egypt to Indonesia and in several American cities, demonstrators again took to the streets, shouting down Israel and its allies, especially the United States, and demanding an immediate ceasefire. At a rare government-approved protest in Cairo, crowds chanted cries of solidarity with Palestine. I am a mother. I have children. I feel their pain while they watch as their children get killed, said Hadi Mohsen, 38, a freelance artist in the Egyptian capital. Israeli strikes have killed 4,137 people in Gaza and wounded more than 13,200, Palestinian officials say. At least 1,400 people in Israel have been killed and more than 4,500 injured since the October 7 attack, Israeli officials say. Hamas, rampaging through villages and kibbutz settlements, took more than 200 people hostage. The Ronins were in Israel to celebrate a family birthday and the Jewish high holy days. Their release sent relief through the Israeli-American community. Natalie, 17, had recently graduated high school. "I pray for them to come back alive," Natalie's aunt, Sigel Zamir, told the Associated Press last week. "They're innocent and loving, and they didn't do anything." U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said a team from the U.S. Embassy was en route to meet the Ronins. "No family, anywhere, should have to experience this torture," he told reporters. 10 Americans remained unaccounted for, Blinken said, and authorities knew that Hamas was holding at least some of them hostage. Diplomats were working feverishly to secure their release, Blinken said. He declined to share further details. The Ronins' release spurred more urgent calls for the remaining hostages to be set free. The Hostages and Missing Families Forum, a group in Israel, sought to pressure Arab leaders in the region to work to return their loved ones safely. Hamas committed war crimes, the group said in a statement. Many leaders in Arab states have tremendous influence over its leaders and must act to immediately release all the hostages and missing held in Gaza. A spokesperson for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israeli authorities will continue to operate with the best of their abilities and efforts in order to locate all of the missing and return all of the abductees home. At the same time, Netanyahu added in his own statement, "We continue to fight until victory." Hiba Farouk Mahfouz contributed to this report. Aid remains stalled as UN chief visits Rafah crossing. Rafah, Egypt, trucks of desperately needed aid for Gaza remained stuck on the Egyptian side of the Rafah crossing on Friday, a holdup that United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said left him with a broken heart during a brief and chaotic visit to the highly militarized zone. During his high-profile visit to Israel, President Biden announced a deal to get aid flowing into the besieged enclave, but days later wrangling over the conditions continued. "We are witnessing a paradox. Behind these walls, we have 2 million people that is suffering enormously, that has no water, no food, no medicine, no fuel, that is under fire, that needs everything to survive," Guterres said. "On this side, we have seen so many trucks, loaded with water, with fuel, with medicines, with food, exactly the same things that are needed on this side of the wall. It is impossible to be here and not to feel a broken heart," he said. UN officials had hoped that Guterres' media tour Friday would coincide with the resumption of trucks driving across the border, a moment of triumph and relief after days of high-level, high-stakes diplomacy in Cairo and Tel Aviv. Instead, Guterres found himself facing stalled trucks and angry Egyptian aid workers, frustrated at the wait to bring assistance to Palestinians just a few miles away. In a demonstration clearly blessed, and seemingly organized, by the Egyptian authorities, aid workers waving Palestinian and Egyptian flags chanted, "We stand for Gaza," as soldiers in fatigues watched. The aid convoy, and the difficult deal-making to get it across the border, represent the opening gambit in efforts to seek a steady flow of relief supplies into Gaza. On Saturday, Egyptian officials plan to host a summit for peace, which Guterres is scheduled to attend before returning to New York. At a meeting with top European Union envoys in Washington, Biden suggested the aid would begin moving Saturday or Sunday and blamed the delays on the need to repair roads that were in very bad shape. Inside Gaza, however, Palestinians told the Washington Post that distributing the aid would be extremely dangerous for them without a halt in Israeli airstrikes, which have continued across the coastal enclave, including in areas in the south that Israel said would be considered safe zones. In a briefing Friday, Israeli military spokesman Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari said Israeli planes had been bombing Gaza at a rate not seen for decades, ahead of the next stage of operations, which is expected to include a ground invasion. Under a deal reached with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Biden said 20 trucks would be permitted to cross the border into the besieged Gaza Strip. He re-emphasized his commitment to the deal Friday, saying the people of Gaza urgently need food, water, and medicine in a statement. "That's a fraction of the more than 200 trucks from the United Nations, Egyptian Red Crescent and other sources that are ready to deliver supplies to Gaza." Guterres said the details of how the aid will be verified and whether it will be a continuous flow remain under discussion. Ahmed Abu Zaid, a spokesman for Egypt's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, pinned the blame on Israel's targeted attacks and refusal of aid entry in a statement posted to X Friday. Rafah crossing is open and Egypt is not responsible of obstructing third country nationals' exit, he added, referring to another stalled deal to allow U.S. nationals to leave Gaza through Rafah. Guterres acknowledged that a mechanism for ensuring that no illicit goods are smuggled in along with the aid has proven to be an obstacle in negotiations. We are now actively engaged with Israel, Egypt and the United States, he said. Those verifications need to be effective, and at the same time, those verifications need to be done in a way that is practical and in a way that is expedited. The United Nations has offered up their inspectors, who have conducted similar checks on aid entering northwest Syria. But a key sticking point has been that the Israelis want direct eyes on the crossing, said an official with knowledge of the situation who spoke on the condition of anonymity to describe the delicate negotiations. The question is where and how, the official said. Egypt has signaled that hosting Israeli inspectors on its soil is a non-starter. Frustrations are mounting among Egyptian aid workers and volunteers who have been waiting at the border for days to move critical supplies. We demand the opening of the crossing so we can support our Palestinian brothers, said Abdulrahman El Said, 22, a volunteer with Abna Sinai, a regional logistics company that also does charity work. He had been stuck there for 4 days, waiting to bring medicine and food aid across to Gaza, he said. Ahead of his visit to the crossing, Guterres inspected a flight at the Arish airport carrying supplies destined for Gaza. The plane included 44 tons of food supplies donated by the United Arab Emirates, 17 tons of materials for tents and 10 tons of emergency trauma kits to be distributed by the United Nations and the Egyptian Red Crescent. By mid-afternoon Friday, a Jordanian military plane had arrived bearing more aid. We need to have as quickly as possible the first convoy, and we need to create all the guarantees for that first convoy not to be the last, Guterres told reporters on the tarmac. Gaza is fast running out of vital food, fuel, water and medical supplies. Before the latest war broke out, about 455 trucks a day entered the blockaded coastal enclave through Rafah and Israel's Kerem Shalom crossing. Since October 7, Israel has tightened its siege on Gaza, and airstrikes have damaged parts of the Rafah crossing on the Gazan side. The war has also displaced around 1 million of Gaza's 2.3 million people. More than half of the displaced are sheltering in United Nations schools, hospitals and storage centers, according to the UN's refugee agency. Al-Qudra said Friday that 7 hospitals were completely closed due to Israeli shelling and another 21 medical centers shut after running out of fuel. Fuel for the generators at Al-Shifa Hospital, the main hospital in Gaza City and one of the few remaining places with electricity, will run out within 24 hours, Gilmet Thomas, medical coordinator for Doctors Without Borders, said Friday. From Rafah, Guterres thanked the Egyptian government for coordinating aid collection. We are not in a no-man's land. We are in the land of a sovereign country, Egypt, an apparent reference to concern President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has raised about Israel pushing Palestinian refugees to Sinai in large numbers. Sisi, who wants to avoid at all costs the type of skirmishes taking place along the Israel-Lebanon border, warned Wednesday that such an exodus could shatter the peace between Egypt and Israel. Egypt has reinforced its borders since the war began, according to the Sinai Foundation for Human Rights, which has a team monitoring the border region. The UN convoy carrying Guterres passed troops and tanks standing in formation along the highway leading to Rafah. At one point during Guterres' speech, a surveillance drone buzzed overhead. In the meantime, Palestinians in Gaza are spending hours each day waiting in line for meager supplies. Hani Mohammed, 36, is living with his 2 children and 35 other family members in an apartment west of Gaza City. He tried to move south after Israel demanded 1 million Palestinians leave Gaza City and other parts of northern Gaza, but he could not find an affordable taxi as prices for fuel have skyrocketed. My kids are super scared, he said. I cry to myself when I'm on my own. I can't protect the family. Maybe I was wrong when I decided to have children in the first place when I live in Gaza. They are punishing the civilians with no guilt. I don't know who is alive and who is not. We listen to the radio when we charge the batteries from the neighbor who has solar power. I need someone to answer me, he continued. What's the guilt of those kids to be terrified or killed? Berger reported from Ramallah. Belusha reported from Nuseirat refugee camp. Marissa Iotti in Washington contributed to this report. Election denialism is one key factor that led to Jim Jordan's defeat. As Representative Jim Jordan, Republican, Ohio, waged his battle to become House Speaker, some House Republicans were uncomfortable with the possibility of having an election denier occupying the most powerful legislative seat in the U.S. government heading into a presidential election year. Jordan, who relinquished his nomination for the speakership on Friday after his third defeat on the House floor, was among the most prolific and vocal GOP lawmakers who worked to convince voters that the 2020 election was stolen from former President Donald Trump, and assisted Trump in his efforts to overturn the election. Along with several of his peers in the House Republican Conference, Jordan refused to comply with a subpoena for testimony from the House Select Committee that investigated the January 6, 2021, attack on the U.S. Capitol. Throughout the course of its investigation, the committee unearthed evidence that Jordan had materially relevant communications with Trump and others about activities pertaining to January 6. Jordan's role in January 6 and his election denialism were not an organizing nor central factor for the roughly 24 Republicans who voted against his speaker bid. But some Republican lawmakers, even some who supported Jordan's bid, raised concerns about his continued refusal to acknowledge Joe Biden's 2020 election win when asked by peers this week. Election denialism has remained a powerful but roiling issue in the Republican Party, despite a disappointing midterm performance in 2022 when election-denying candidates suffered a series of high-profile losses. Among the numerous lawmakers who said they would seek to fill the speaker vacancy on Friday, only Representative Tom Emmer, Republican, Minnesota, voted to certify the 2020 election. Representatives Byron Donalds, Republican, Florida, Kevin Hern, Republican, Florida, Mike Johnson, Republican, Louisiana, and Jack Bergman, Republican, Michigan, all objected to the certification. Some staffers who served on the House Select Committee that investigated January 6 also drew parallels between the tactics employed to stoke false claims of election fraud in 2020 and the pressure campaign waged this week against Jordan's defectors. During a conference meeting on Monday evening, when Jordan was asked by Representative French Hill, Republican, Arkansas, whether he believed Trump won the 2020 election, he declined to answer the question directly, according to lawmakers who were in the closed-door meeting. He answered the question as if it was February 1, 2021, said one lawmaker, who spoke on the condition of anonymity to disclose details of the private meeting. It was disappointing for many members that Jordan could not succinctly answer a simple question, the lawmaker added. On Friday morning, during his last-minute news conference in which he vowed to press ahead with his fledgling speakership bid, Jordan again would not definitively say whether he thought the 2020 election was over. "I think there are all kinds of problems with the 2020 election, I've been clear about that," Jordan said without citing any evidence. Nearly 90 different judges have ruled against Trump and his allies in their efforts to challenge or overturn the 2020 presidential election, according to a Washington Post analysis. Jim, at some point, if he's going to lead this conference during a presidential election cycle, and particularly a presidential election year with primaries and caucuses around the country, is going to have to be strong and say, Donald Trump didn't win the election, Representative Ken Buck, Republican, Colorado, told reporters on Monday. Jordan amplified unsubstantiated claims of voter fraud in the run-up to and after the 2020 election. He also functioned as one of the key conduits, along with Representative Scott Perry, Republican, Pennsylvania, from the House GOP conference to the White House in Trump's quest to overturn his defeat. Jordan sowed unsubstantiated claims of election fraud across conservative media, encouraged Trump not to concede the election, spoke at Stop the Steal rallies, and met with Trump campaign officials ahead of January 6, where they discussed social media tactics and the march to the Capitol. Committee investigators also obtained White House records that showed that Jordan spoke with Trump on the morning of the January 6 attack for 10 minutes. Jordan has never disclosed the content of their call. Many fault lines have materialized in the House GOP conference since Representative Kevin McCarthy, Republican, California, was ousted as Speaker earlier this month, and 4 of Jordan's detractors were also among those who objected to certifying that Biden won the 2020 election. But the majority of them voted to certify Biden's victory, including Buck, and Representatives Vern Buchanan, Republican, Florida; Drew Ferguson, Republican, Georgia; Don Bacon, Arnab; Mike Simpson, Republican, Idaho; John Rutherford, Republican, Florida, and others. These lawmakers have been the target of credible violent threats and threatening phone calls, which some investigators and lawyers who served on the House Select Committee investigating the January 6 attack view as an extension of some of the tactics employed to activate rioters who stormed the Capitol. The threats, which only hardened opposition to Jordan, included unnerving calls to staffers, spouses, and family members. Some members took extra security precautions, including Representative Drew Ferguson, Republican, Georgia, who requested a sheriff be stationed at his daughter's school. Lisa Bianco, a longtime former House staffer who worked for the January 6 committee, said that Jordan's allies were following the same playbook used during the Stop the Steal efforts in 2020, and noted that even some of the lead Stop the Steal rally organizers were driving the pressure campaign against GOP holdouts. These groups broadcast messages over social media, imploring followers to attend in-person rallies, to fight and not back down, ultimately ending in the storming of the Capitol, said Bianco. Jim Jordan worked with those groups in 2020, even speaking at rallies, and now continues to deploy those strategies by denying the validity of the 2020 election. Amy Kramer, a co-founder of Women for Trump and one of the lead organizers of the rally that preceded the January 6 insurrection, has been organizing #JordanForSpeaker rallies to target members opposing Jordan at their district offices. Kramer, who has touted deep ties to members of Congress over the years, has also posted the phone numbers of various lawmakers' offices on X, the site formerly known as Twitter, encouraging supporters to call and voice support for Jordan. Kramer posted Friday morning the numbers for Scalise's D.C. and district offices, urging people to tell Scalise to call off the dogs and have his people support Jordan. Jordan has denounced the threats against Republicans who oppose his bid to become Speaker. On Wednesday, Jordan tried to quell the anger by posting on X, "No American should accost another for their beliefs. We condemn all threats against our colleagues, and it is imperative that we come together. Stop. It's abhorrent." But Rutherford, a recipient of some of these threats, placed the blame for the toxic pressure campaign squarely on the Ohio lawmaker. "He's absolutely responsible for it, and look, it doesn't work, especially against people like Stephen Womack, Republican, Arkansas, and others," Rutherford said. "Nobody likes to have their arm twisted. Talking about individuals' wives and those sorts of things? That's just not acceptable." Representative Benny G. Thompson, Democrat, Mississippi, who chaired the January 6 committee, said that Jordan's rise to Speaker-designate was a sad commentary on the state of Congress and the Republican Party. "When you ignore the laws of the land, vote against a legitimate election, without any evidence to the contrary, and now to be Speaker, is not good for the country," Thompson said this week. "Jordan was part of the obstruction of the committee's work and I don't see him changing his colors." An previous version of this article misidentified the party affiliation of Representative Benny G. Thompson of Mississippi. He is a Democrat, not a Republican. The article has been corrected. The media navigates a war of words for reporting on Gaza and Israel. News outlets and readers debate terms such as terrorists versus militants, invasion versus incursion. Ever since armed men from Gaza crossed into Israel and killed some 1,400 people, news organizations have wrestled with how to describe who they were and whom they represented. Were they terrorists? Anchors on CNN and Fox News said they were. Or were they militants, The Washington Post, BBC? Or gunmen, NPR? Or fighters, Al Jazeera English? Were they the foot soldiers of a terrorist organization, Business Insider, or of the governing power in the Gaza Strip, the New York Times? Words matter, particularly to news organizations that try to preserve accuracy and impartiality at moments of great passion and uncertainty. A badly chosen word in a media account, particularly during a bloody conflict involving Israelis and Palestinians, can elicit swift denunciations from readers, listeners, and viewers. As the Vice President of Standards at the Associated Press, Amanda Barrett sits at the forefront of debates over fair and neutral phrasing within her own news organization and among others. Barrett leads the team that edits the AP Stylebook, on which countless news outlets rely for consistent terminology in their reporting. Since the war began, Barrett and her staff have been fielding calls and emails from reporters and editors about how to render various aspects of the conflict. Terrorist versus militant comes up a lot, Barrett says. The AP stylebook advises against terrorist, deeming it politicized and inconsistently applied, though the U.S. government designated Hamas a terrorist organization in 1997. Occupation is also problematic, Barrett suggests. While Israel controls most of Gaza's borders and infrastructure, it withdrew its soldiers and settlements in 2005. As an alternative, Barrett recommends describing the situation rather than labeling it. Another issue was Israel's announcement that residents of northern Gaza move south in evacuation order or, as some have claimed, ethnic cleansing? The former, according to the AP stylebook. Some journalists aren't even sure how to refer to the violence. Is it a war or merely a conflict? And who are the adversaries, Israel and Gaza, Israel and Hamas, or Israel and Palestinians? Barrett acknowledges that each construction conveys a slightly different meaning and point of view, given that the combatants go beyond Hamas to include groups such as the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. For the record, the AP stylebook gives its blessing to the latest war between Israel and Hamas or simply the Israel-Hamas war, with a lowercase w. We're very, very busy trying to find the best way forward, Barrett says. Other news organizations have their own style guides tailored for the current conflict. The Washington Post Standards Desk decreed last week that Hamas's attack can be called terrorism, ideally in the context of a quotation from an individual. In the rare cases in which we would use it without attribution, we require approval from a department head or deputy managing editor, the Post's guidance says. Also out, according to the Post, calling Hamas's initial rampage an invasion. The preferred description, attack or incursion. Other hot-button social issues, such as abortion, rate similar debates within newsrooms. Is it pro-life or pro-choice? Fetus or unborn child? Even before his term as president, Donald Trump sparked another discussion of vocabulary. Does he propagate falsehoods, misstatements, or just plain lies? A third one, when is it fair to label someone's statement as racist? It's a balancing act between striving for accuracy and inflaming a volatile situation. Users of X, formerly Twitter, reacted with fury Thursday when a photo caption in the Post said Hamas had detained the children of an Israeli woman featured in a news story. Editors quickly agreed this was an egregious choice of words and changed the caption to taken hostage. A pro-Israeli watchdog group, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, has singled out journalists over the past couple of weeks. The committee criticized Sarah Yassin, a managing editor of the Los Angeles Times, for reposting tweets that used the terms genocide and ethnic cleansing to describe Israel's military response to Hamas. A Times spokesperson defended Yassin, saying, sharing the posts or content of others does not equal an endorsement of it. The BBC, meanwhile, said it has launched an investigation of 6 journalists in its Arab language service whom the watchdog group accused of anti-Israeli bias for, among other things, tweets comparing Hamas militants to freedom fighters. The biggest media furor so far involves news coverage of a massive explosion at a Gaza hospital that killed an unknown number of people this week. Several news organizations, Reuters, the Associated Press, MSNBC, Politico, the New York Times, Axios, initially indicated that the blast came from an Israeli airstrike. These reports relied on statements by Hamas's health ministry, a source of questionable credibility, and contributed to violent street protests across the Arab world. But a few hours later Israeli officials raised doubts about the cause of the explosion, pointing instead to an errant rocket fired from within Gaza. This was buttressed by statements from American officials, including President Biden, and the release of videos and audio recordings supporting the Israeli position. The evolving story prompted some fancy linguistic footwork. The New York Times' first headline declared, Israeli strike kills hundreds in hospital, Palestinians say. Later came a second version, at least 500 dead in strike on Gaza hospital, Palestinians say. This was followed by a more neutral construction, hundreds dead in blast at Gaza hospital, Palestinians say. While other news organizations made similar changes, few issued corrections or acknowledged the questionable nature of their initial stories. During any breaking news event, we report what we know as we learn it, says New York Times spokesman Charlie Stadlander. We apply rigor and care to what we publish, explicitly citing sources and noting when a piece of news is breaking and likely to be updated. And as the facts on the ground become more clear, we continue reporting. Even days after the blast and the questions about its origin, headlines continued to describe it as a strike, a word that conveys planning and intention, neither of which has been established. Strike? Blast? Or just a ghastly accident amid wider violence? In such a perilous and fraught context, precision is a virtue, a necessity, and a challenge. Hundreds of Americans trapped in Gaza with no place safe for us to go. The teenager stands in the middle of a hospital ward, his tank top covered in blood. His cheek is bandaged. One hand is wrapped in gauze, and in the other, he holds up his U.S. passport. "Where is the state that should protect me?" asked Yusuf Abushaban, 18, in a video recorded at a Gaza hospital this week and posted on Instagram. "Look at me, I was bombed." Yusuf is one of at least 400 Americans trapped in Gaza as Israel mounts a siege of the enclave, cutting off supplies of food, water, fuel and medicine to more than 2 million people amid a relentless aerial bombardment. As the conditions in Gaza grow increasingly dire, Americans are caught. Israel shut down its crossings with Gaza after an unprecedented attack by Hamas, which controls the enclave, and a ground offensive by Israeli forces is expected soon. Egypt's priority, meanwhile, is moving humanitarian aid into Gaza from its border with the enclave, not getting foreign nationals out. On Wednesday, following a visit to Israel, President Biden told reporters that he was hopeful we can get some Americans out of Gaza, without providing further detail. For Yusuf's family, such hopes were too late. His younger sister, Joud, 14, was killed in the airstrike that damaged the family's home in Gaza City, said Yusuf's cousin Bagat Abushaban, who lives in Michigan. Yusuf's father, Abdelaziz, who is blind, was seriously injured in the bombing. "Doctors have said they are not sure they can perform the surgeries necessary to save his arm," said Bagat, who is receiving updates from other members of the family. Yusuf was born in Michigan and is the only American citizen in his immediate family, his cousin said. His father studied at Western Michigan University and worked in the state for several years. In another video recorded at the hospital, Yusuf said he felt abandoned by the U.S. government. "What did we do to deserve this?" he said. "We're civilians, everyone here is a civilian." In addition to the hundreds of Americans who were in Gaza when the war broke out, there are also an unknown number of U.S. citizens among the 200 hostages captured by Hamas during its brutal attack on Israel on October 7. 2 American hostages, Judith and Natalie Ronan, a mother and daughter from Illinois, were released Friday. The Palestinian Americans trapped in Gaza are growing increasingly desperate. Many of them left the United States for what they thought would be a brief trip only to find themselves in the middle of a war. In late September, Hesham Kaoud, 55, traveled to Gaza with 3 of his brothers and his 20-year-old nephew Amir. All 5 are American citizens. Amir had never been outside the United States before. They were supposed to stay for 2 weeks and were looking forward to spending time at the beach, said Hesham's wife, Haifa. Each morning, Haifa gets her 8-year-old daughter ready for school at their home outside Dallas. Then she waits for the call that will prove her husband is still alive. When Hesham calls, she asks him whether he is eating and sleeping. She tells him to stay safe. On Thursday, Hesham told her there had been an airstrike near the house where he and his brothers are staying. Hesham said he was scared that he might not see his children again. Haifa, 53, told him to just hang on. "I keep waiting and hoping," she said. "He has to come back home. All his life is here." Like many other Americans in Gaza, Hesham and his family have moved toward the south of the enclave, both because of evacuation directives from Israel and to be closer to the Rafah border, crossing with Egypt. Over the past week, the State Department has told U.S. citizens in Gaza at least twice that the crossing might open, potentially allowing them to leave. But it has remained closed. Yusuf, the American teenager who was injured, also went to Rafah, his cousin said, staying there for days. When the crossing did not open, his family returned home to Gaza City. A spokesperson for the State Department said that it could not comment on individual cases due to privacy considerations, and added that it is providing U.S. citizens with the best information it has in an incredibly difficult and fluid situation. Biden said Friday that he received a commitment from Israel and Egypt that the Rafah crossing from Gaza will open, possibly in the following 24 to 48 hours, and an initial aid convoy of 20 trucks will be allowed to enter. If Rafah Gate is open to allow humanitarian aid to go in, we will be trying to get out the American citizens who are in Gaza who want to leave, Matthew Miller, a State Department spokesman, said at a briefing Thursday. But the negotiations are fraught. Israel, Egypt and the United Nations are finalizing a process for verifying that trucks going into Gaza contain only humanitarian supplies. Egypt also wants assurances that Israel will not bomb the crossing, experts say. Americans and other foreign nationals have become a bargaining chip simply because Israel, which is the occupying force, is not delivering what is required to be delivered, said Amr Hamzawi, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington and a former member of Egypt's parliament. Aboud Okal, 36, and Wafa Abizadeh, 29, live outside Boston. The couple has been trapped in Gaza with their 1-year-old son Youssef since the war began. They've moved south to be closer to the Rafah crossing, but Israel has continued to launch airstrikes in the area. They've resorted to drinking salty water on occasion and are running out of cooking fuel. We are extremely afraid for our lives, Okal said Thursday afternoon, minutes after an airstrike hit so nearby that the windows shattered in the house where they are staying. There is no place safe for us to go and no evacuation plan on the horizon. Sarah Dadouch in Beirut and Karen DeYoung and Michael Birnbaum in Washington contributed to this report. Supreme Court says White House may continue requests to tech companies. The Supreme Court on Friday temporarily allowed the Biden administration to continue its efforts to get social media companies to remove posts from their platforms that the government says are misleading. The administration had asked the justices to put on hold a lower court ruling that found top officials likely violated the First Amendment by improperly pressuring tech companies to take down what they saw as problematic posts about public health and election-related disinformation. The importance of the issue was underscored by the court's decision Friday to accept the case for oral argument this term, which would mean a ruling before end of June. As is customary in emergency orders, the majority did not explain its reasoning for granting the administration's request. But conservative Justices Samuel A. Alito Jr., Clarence Thomas and Neil M. Gorsuch dissented from the decision not to leave the lower court order in place, calling the development highly disturbing. The lawsuit against the federal government, initiated by Republican attorneys general in Louisiana and Missouri, raises significant and novel questions about how free speech protections apply online, with implications for how government officials interact with social media companies and communicate with the public on the popular platforms. Jamil Jaffer, executive director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University, called the case a significant opportunity for the Supreme Court to resolve an increasingly urgent and relevant issue. The justices have said little about how lower courts should distinguish permissible persuasion from unconstitutional coercion, Jaffer said. These are momentous, thorny issues, and how the court resolves them will have broad implications for the digital public sphere. Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey, Republican, called the administration's social media lobbying the worst First Amendment violation in our nation's history. We look forward to dismantling Joe Biden's vast censorship enterprise at the nation's highest court, he said in a statement. In asking the Supreme Court to intervene in the matter, Solicitor General Elizabeth B. Prelogar wrote in a court filing that the order issued by an appeals court last month would impose unprecedented limits on the administration's ability to use the bully pulpit to address matters of public concern and call attention to potentially harmful online content. The lawsuit claims government officials censored protected political speech by urging tech companies to modify posts involving elections and the coronavirus vaccine. Conservatives have long argued that liberal employees inside tech companies are working with Democratic officials to silence conservative views when making content moderation decisions, a claim that tech companies and government officials dispute. Federal interference fundamentally transforms online discourse, rendering entire viewpoints virtually unspeakable on social media, the attorneys general told the High Court in a filing that urged the justices to let the appeals court order take effect. In July, a district court judge in Louisiana sided with the states and issued a sweeping injunction that bars thousands of federal employees across a range of government departments and agencies from improperly pressuring or coercing tech companies to remove specific content. The conservative U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit last month limited that order to the White House, the Surgeon General's office, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the FBI. The three-judge appeals court panel said the White House likely coerced the platforms to make their moderation decisions by way of intimidating messages and threats of adverse consequences. The panel also found the White House significantly encouraged the platform's decisions by commandeering their decision-making processes, both in violation of the First Amendment. The opinion details White House efforts to pressure social media companies to remove misinformation about the coronavirus pandemic. Officials were not shy in their requests, calling for posts to be removed ASAP and appearing persistent and angry, according to the ruling. It describes a contentious period in July 2021, which reached a boiling point when President Biden accused Facebook of killing people. We find, like the district court, that the officials' communications, reading them in context, not in isolation, were on the whole intimidating, the judges wrote. The panel subsequently broadened its order this month to extend to government officials with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, saying those officials probably acted improperly in trying to coordinate with Silicon Valley to protect elections from online hoaxes. The First Amendment protects against government infringement on speech. Officials are permitted to tell a company when content on its website is problematic or misleading, and to advocate for administration policies. But officials cannot coerce private companies to take action on the government's behalf or threaten to punish people for expressing different views. The question for courts to unravel is how to distinguish between permitted government speech and prohibited coercion or threats. Government officials routinely engage with companies like Facebook and YouTube. The FBI, for instance, shares information with platforms about accounts that appear to be used by covert foreign actors to influence the American public. Tech companies and the government expanded efforts to fight against disinformation online after Russian interference on the platforms during the 2016 election. But such content moderation efforts have become embroiled in the nation's culture wars, and many companies are now cutting back on the number of employees who do such work. In its request to the Supreme Court to temporarily block the Fifth Circuit's order while it is appealed, the Biden administration warned of drastic consequences if the limits on government officials are allowed to take effect. There is a fundamental distinction between persuasion and coercion. And courts must take care to maintain that distinction because of the drastic consequences resulting from a finding of coercion, Prelogar wrote. Alito said in his 5-page dissent on Friday that his colleagues should have allowed the lower court's ruling to stand while the High Court resolves the matter. Alito said he doubted the type of bully pulpit speech Prelogar worried about would be prohibited if the Fifth Circuit injunction were in effect. He noted that Biden would not be subject to the appeals court order, which applies only when the government crosses the line to coerce or control the free speech rights of others. Government censorship of private speech is antithetical to our democratic form of government, and therefore today's decision is highly disturbing, wrote Alito, who was joined by Thomas and Gorsuch. At this time in the history of our country, what the court has done, I fear, will be seen by some as giving the government a green light to use heavy-handed tactics to skew the presentation of views on the medium that increasingly dominates the dissemination of news. The Supreme Court has also agreed to review a separate pair of cases about removing controversial material on social media platforms. The Biden administration has asked the court to reverse a decision upholding a Texas law barring companies from taking down posts based on political ideology. That ruling is at odds with a decision from a different appeals court, which blocked a similar Florida law from taking effect. The case accepted on Friday is Morthy v. Missouri. Acquitted Virginia murder defendant sues Arlington police detective. Chris Johnson was charged with murder for hire in the 1998 slaying of Andrea Cincotta and was found not guilty by jury in less than an hour. A Northern Virginia man who was acquitted of a charge that he hired a career criminal to kill his fiancée in 1998 has sued the lead homicide detective in the case, alleging that she lied to a grand jury to obtain an indictment. The plaintiff, James Christopher Johnson, alleges that Arlington County Police Detective Rosa Ortiz enticed the admitted killer, Bobby Joe Leonard, into implicating Johnson in a long-ago crime he did not commit. More than 2 decades after the killing, Johnson wound up being charged with murder for hire, but he was found not guilty by a trial jury last year after less than an hour of deliberations. The lawsuit is the latest twist in the case of Andrea Sincata, a popular public librarian in Arlington County who was found strangled in August 1998 in her apartment in the Colonial Village complex on North Road Street. Police initially suspected Johnson, her fiancé, and interrogated him intensely for 3 days immediately after the killing. But not until 23 years later, in 2021, was Johnson finally charged in the killing, based on statements to police by Leonard. According to trial testimony, Leonard, in 2018, told Ortiz, a cold case homicide detective, that a man had called him many years earlier and offered him $5,000 to kill Sincata. At trial, Leonard said he didn't know the man's name and had never met him. Leonard described killing Sincata in grisly detail. He said he had been in the apartment she shared with Johnson once before, to take away a personal computer that Sincata gave him. Leonard also said he spoke to Sincata's fiancé on the phone once, when he needed help using the computer. Leonard said the same man later called him, asked him to kill Sincata, and told him that $5,000 would be waiting in the master bedroom closet, where Leonard said he left Sincata's body. But there was no money. Instead, Leonard said he took Sincata's Honda Civic and some coins and drove off. He said he never attempted to collect the $5,000 from Johnson because he knew that he, Leonard, was a suspect and feared that police might be watching him. The following year, Leonard was arrested for sexually assaulting and attempting to kill a 13-year-old girl in Fairfax County and was sentenced to life in prison, partly because of his lengthy criminal record. As for Johnson, he maintained his innocence from the start, except for a brief segment near the end of a 28-hour Arlington police interrogation, in which he said he had a vision in which he knocked Sincata down and she hit her head on a desk. He later renounced this statement, and 2 experts, a criminologist and a veteran homicide investigator, told Arlington police that Johnson's incriminating statement was false, in their opinions. Also, according to trial testimony, the detectives involved in the case in 1998 falsely told Johnson that his fingerprints had been found on Sincata's body and that her time of death was after Johnson had come home from work. Still, he was not charged, until after Leonard, while in prison for attacking the 13-year-old girl, volunteered his account of Sincata's death in 2018. He eventually pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, testified at Johnson's trial last year, and received another life sentence. At his sentencing in November, Leonard called himself a very evil, sadistic person. In Johnson's 4-week trial, though, the jury was not convinced that he had hired Leonard. Jury foreman Chen Ling said after the verdict that Leonard's testimony was the only thing the prosecution really had. There were too many other possibilities. We did not get beyond a reasonable doubt. In his lawsuit, filed Thursday in U.S. District Court in Alexandria, Johnson alleged that Leonard's story was fantastically implausible and that Ortiz had suggested to Leonard that he might get leniency if his story involved murder for hire. Leonard volunteered to tell the story only if he wouldn't face the death penalty, and then Commonwealth's attorney Theo Stamos agreed to that condition. The lawsuit alleges that Ortiz told an Arlington grand jury in 2019 that Leonard had identified Johnson by name to her, but Leonard later testified he never knew the caller's name. Ortiz also allegedly told the grand jury that Sincata's injuries matched Johnson's vision statement, even though Johnson had claimed she suffered a fatal head injury, and her actual cause of death was strangulation. The lawsuit also claims Ortiz told the grand jury that there were no signs of struggle. Yet Sincata had multiple cuts and bruises on her head, upper body, and legs. Ortiz did not return messages seeking comment. Arlington Commonwealth's attorney Parisa Degani-Tofty, who obtained the indictment against Johnson, also declined to comment. Kevin Sincata, Andrea Sincata's son, said after reading the lawsuit, "There's lots of information in the public domain that suggests it was right and proper for the grand jury to indict both Bobby Leonard and Chris Johnson in my mother's murder. I applaud the grand jury for getting it right, and I applaud Detective Ortiz for promptly executing the arrest warrants that flowed as a result of those indictments." For 2 decades, Kevin Sincata believed in Johnson's innocence, but in 2018 he started to doubt his mother's fiancé, conducted a recorded interview with Johnson to try to elicit admissions, and now contributes to a website which alleges Johnson is guilty. He said he does not own the website. Kevin Sincata noted the website shows that Leonard knew details of Andrea Sincata's schedule that only Johnson would have known. She came home at lunchtime and was likely killed then, but didn't normally come home at noon. The website notes that crime scene photos show Johnson had placed a laundry basket next to the closet door where Cincotta was found, but claimed not to have seen her until more than 7 hours later. Leonard identified the caller as Andrea's boyfriend, Kevin, Cincotta said. Since she had only one boyfriend, this is equivalent to identifying Johnson. He also said Leonard gained no benefit from confessing, since it added a murder conviction to his record and made him less likely to be moved to a less secure prison, a condition he sought during the trial. House Speaker race starts again for Republicans after ousting Jordan. House Republicans on Friday removed Representative Jim Jordan, Republican, Ohio, as their nominee for Speaker of the House after he failed repeatedly to earn the necessary votes to take the gavel, again delaying the House from reopening for business. Jordan and his allies spent all week trying to convince Republican colleagues that he was the right person to be named Speaker, calling for the conference to unite around the conservative firebrand favored by the Republican base and former President Donald Trump. But their argument was stymied by several issues, ranging from the political to the personal. Some members were put off by Jordan's failure to quickly and vigorously condemn threats against lawmakers who had voted against him. Some thought he hadn't done enough to show he could lead all Republicans and not just the far-right flank. And he couldn't overcome inter-party resentments that have lingered either for years or developed over the past week, particularly after Jordan and his allies' aggressive campaign to get their votes. In the first round of voting earlier this week, 20 Republicans opposed him, a number that only climbed with each vote, demonstrating he had no path to victory. In Friday's vote, another 3 Republicans turned away from Jordan, Representatives Brian Fitzpatrick, PA, Tom Keene Jr., NJ, and Marcus J. Molinaro, New York, who each represent competitive swing districts. In total, 25 Republicans voted against Jordan and no lawmakers flipped to support him. Jordan lost more support than he gained during each of the 3 rounds of voting, a sign that his pressure campaign had backfired. Exasperated, Republicans conferred Friday afternoon and voted 112 to 86 to remove him as their speaker-designate, triggering a new round of candidate forums next week to elect a new speaker-designate, their third in as many weeks. Jordan afterward said he had no regrets about how he handled his run and hopes the GOP conference can elect someone. "We have to come together, and I think we will," he said. Lacking a permanent speaker for 17 days, the House has not considered any legislation since September 30, when then-Speaker Kevin McCarthy, Republican, California, announced a last-gasp proposal to avert a government shutdown. The legislation passed the House with more than 200 Democrats supporting it, which led to McCarthy's removal as Speaker 3 days later. Majority Leader Steve Scalise, Republican, Louisiana, also could not earn the necessary 217 votes on the House floor to wield the Speaker's gavel, leading him to drop out of the race last week and paving the way for Jordan to try to secure the votes this week. Members from opposite ends of the Republican conference suggested that, now that each wing has taken down the other's preferred choice in Scalise and Jordan, they might be able to have a fresh start next week with new candidates who do not have long histories in the House. "It was pretty ugly. So I'm hoping that now we can all get together and then kind of, move forward," said Representative Mario Diaz-Balart, Republican, Florida, who was staunchly against Jordan's candidacy. Some names began to emerge almost immediately after Jordan's loss Friday. Majority Whip Tom Emmer, R-Min, who several Republicans had previously discussed as a possible consensus candidate for the fractious conference, has begun making calls for the speakership, according to a person close to Emmer, who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss private conversations. Representatives Kevin Hern, Republican, Oklahoma, Jack Bergman, Republican, Michigan, Pete Sessions, Republican, Texas, and Austin Scott, Republican, Georgia, have publicly declared they're running for Speaker, with half a dozen other Republicans mulling a bid. Republicans have until Sunday to declare their candidacies, and the conference will vote Tuesday to choose a new speaker-designate. McCarthy quickly endorsed Emmer Friday, saying in a statement that his ally in leadership is the right person for the job and can unite the conference. Republicans' inability to coalesce around any member within their ranks has left them feeling dejected, frustrated, and close to hopeless that they may never be able to uniformly decide on a GOP speaker since they can only lose 4 votes to approve anything or anyone through their fractious majority. Now, how somebody gets to 217 in this life and not in heaven is a good question for all of us to ask. But I am, as I said, seriously considering and still praying about it, said Representative Judy Byington, Republican, Texas, as he weighs whether to also run for Speaker. But several Jordan allies were angered with colleagues about forcing Jordan to drop out of the race, harboring bad feelings that could bleed into next week and negatively influence the election process. The most popular Republican in the United States Congress was just knifed by a secret ballot in a private meeting in the basement of the Capitol. It's as swampy as swamp gets. And Jim Jordan deserves better than that, said Representative Matt Gaetz, Republican, Florida, who mobilized McCarthy's ouster earlier this month. But Representative Tim Burchett, Republican, Tennessee, who also voted to remove McCarthy as Speaker, said he's willing to search for a new option. Let's get on with it. I'm ready, he said. I think we can do that. With as many as 10 Republicans possibly declaring candidacies by Sunday, some Republicans worry that the crowded field could lead into several rounds of voting behind closed doors before a majority of them can get behind a candidate. It's probably impossible to mount a campaign for Speaker in just a couple of days, said Representative Anthony Desposito, Republican, New York, a vulnerable Republican who voted against Jordan. The process took McCarthy, Nancy Pelosi, and many others months and years to build the confidence in members to get across the finish line. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle want to reopen the House as quickly as possible, in part to begin the process of providing more aid to Israel for its war with Hamas. But they are also staring down a more pressing deadline. In less than a month, the short-term funding bill McCarthy pushed through runs out and the government will shut down without additional legislation. A significant group of Republicans wanted the House to vote on an expected bipartisan resolution that would have empowered Speaker pro tempore Patrick T. McHenry, Republican, North Carolina, to temporarily perform the functions of Speaker until January 3, 2024. The resolution, which was drafted by Representative David Joyce, Republican, Ohio, and backed in large part by the group he chairs, the Republican Governance Group, would have required a significant number of Democratic votes to pass, which they had signaled they could provide. But the fractious conference that was boiling over with tense feelings toward each other nixed consideration of the resolution on Thursday and instead chose to oust Jordan and restart the search for a consensus Speaker. It's up to the other members to finally come to the conclusion that, even if we're still in the process of trying to elect the Speaker, it would sure be nice to open the place up so we can conduct the business of the House and the business of the American people, Joyce said. Liz Goodwin contributed to this report. Russian tycoon claims he is behind Forbes purchase, audiotapes show. Austin Russell, the American tech founder leading the deal, says there is no Russian involvement. When Magomed Muzov, a Kremlin-connected tycoon, gathered friends in New York to celebrate his 60th birthday, he was joined at the head table by top executives from the Forbes Media Group. According to people who attended the June event, the revelers also included American tech founder Austin Russell, 28, who had recently announced that he was leading an $800 million deal to buy the storied media business. Days before the party, however, Muzov had told associates that he was the Forbes buyer and had sealed the deal of a lifetime, according to 5 audio recordings and 1 video recording obtained by the Washington Post in which he discussed the deal. I just bought Global Forbes, Muzov told one of his associates, according to the material, referring to the Forbes Media Group, which includes the U.S. edition of the magazine. You understand, when you have in your hands the key to the most authoritative global brand, this key will give me access to anyone. Muzov repeated the claim again and again, according to the tapes. In one of the recordings, the videotape reviewed by the Post, he called Russell the face of the deal and insisted his own involvement be kept quiet. I am doing it more subtly, he said, according to the recording. You understand, he said at one point, I am not working with a sledgehammer, nor with a scalpel, but with a laser. Muzov's comments raise fresh questions about potential foreign influence in a major media deal, which has been a source of controversy for more than a year, attracting criticism on Capitol Hill and scrutiny by the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. In a statement to the Post, Russell denied any involvement by Muzov or any Russian individuals in the deal. Muzov has no involvement whatsoever in the Forbes transaction. Any suggestion to the contrary is false, said a spokesperson for Russell. There is not a single dollar of capital from any Chinese or Russian citizen or entity, including Muzov. It's unclear from the tapes whether Muzov was describing himself as a kingmaker, rather than an investor, who had helped bring the deal together and would garner future influence from his role, whether he was a secret investor putting money into the transaction through others, or whether he was simply making false or exaggerated claims. Muzov told the Post in an initial interview that any suggestion he had control of the deal was absolute nonsense and a monstrous myth, and that in the deal documents, in any written form, my participation is not there. He denied he could have told his associates he had bought Forbes, but he did not respond to subsequent requests for comment about the tapes. In a later emailed statement, he said, "I have no investment in this transaction and no plans to invest in any way in the future, whether directly or indirectly." Axios reported in May, citing two unnamed individuals, that Muzov had brought Russell into the process to acquire Forbes, though it didn't describe Muzov as an investor or buyer. Two executives familiar with the situation repeated this claim in interviews with the Post. Both Russell and Muzov deny that the Russian had any involvement in catalyzing the deal, according to Muzov and a person close to Russell. Russell courted potential investors in Silicon Valley and Hollywood over the summer, an attempt to bring in American ownership even as he maintained ties to foreign funders, according to four people who have worked with Russell on the deal, who, like others, spoke on the condition of anonymity to describe private business matters. At the heart of the tangle of conflicting claims sits the relationship between an American tech boy wonder and an older Russian tycoon. In 2016, Muzov had helped land a $20 million seed investment in Russell's then-fledgling company Luminar, according to court documents. That early stake was now the company's second-largest outside shareholder, public financial filings from April show. Best known for its business magazine, Forbes sports a sprawling series of online properties, along with a global franchise of glitzy conferences such as 30 Under 30 and its rankings of wealthy businesspeople. Muzov holds the license to publish Forbes Russia, one of the dozens of local language editions of Forbes magazine that are part of the overall media group, and has close connections to some of the individuals reported to be investors backing Russell, according to a former Muzov business partner, Pavel Cherkashin, as well as three additional people familiar with the deal. Russell's bid for Forbes has attracted the attention of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, according to two people familiar with the matter. "They are 100% looking at it," one of these people said in recent weeks. CFIUS, led by the Treasury Department and made up of several agencies, has the power to probe certain U.S. business transactions for national security risks. It can push for changes or, in rare cases, ask the president to block a deal. CFIUS doesn't disclose its decisions or even which transactions it is examining. CFIUS does not publicly comment on transactions it may or may not be reviewing, said a Treasury spokesperson. In an August 9 letter, Senator Tom Cotton, Republican, Arkansas, and Senator Marco Rubio, Republican, Florida, called on Treasury Secretary Janet L. Yellen, who chairs CFIUS, to review the deal, claiming that Russell was masquerading as the lead buyer while it is evident that Russell is merely a conduit for larger foreign investors. The senators, who both serve on the Senate Intelligence Committee, asserted in the letter that the bulk of the money appeared to be coming from investors with foreign ties, including Shiv Khemka, a close Muzov associate who serves as vice chairman of an Indian conglomerate that has worked with the Kremlin. A Republican Senate staffer told the Post the senator's letter was guided by research conducted on the sale by an Obama-era National Intelligence Council chairman, Greg Treverton. In a memo circulated to policymakers on Capitol Hill in July and seen by the Post, Treverton cited information showing the deal's foreign investors, including, he claimed, Khemka's daughters, would contribute nearly 50% of the total $800 million purchase price, while Russell would be investing only a small fraction of that amount. It appears there is a strong national security argument for the U.S. government to block the buyout, Treverton wrote. Treverton declined to comment further when reached by the Post. It's not in our country's best interest to let a major U.S. media outlet be run by entities with ties to countries such as Russia, Rubio said in a statement to the Post. One person close to Russell's team said some of the accusations, arguably all of the accusations, produced in the senator's letter are false. Similar concerns about foreign influence were raised last year in a different iteration of a deal to acquire Forbes, which quickly collapsed. That plan had been spearheaded by the Hong Kong-based Integrated Whale Media Investments, IWM, which bought Forbes Media from the Forbes family in 2014 and whose owner TC Yam is a Canadian citizen. IWM wanted to take Forbes public through a merger with a Hong Kong-based Special Purpose Acquisition Company, or SPAC, Magnum Opus. But the deal was axed following concerns over Chinese government influence, when 4 U.S. senators had asked Yellen to investigate. Forbes said at the time it was terminating the Magnum Opus takeover amid strong growth that significantly outperformed the financial targets provided at the start of the SPAC transaction. In a statement to the Post, IWM said, having conducted extensive due diligence on the buyer group being led by Austin Russell, we have uncovered no reason for concern with any investors involved in this deal. Russell's announcement in May that he planned to buy Forbes was widely viewed as a surprise. So was the offer valuing Forbes at $800 million, which was $200 million more than the failed SPAC deal's expected price. Some media analysts also balked at the price tag, noting it was more than the combined sale price of the Washington Post, Fortune, and Time. Russell declined to give the Post a precise breakdown of investment in the Forbes deal, saying he was legally bound not to disclose exact terms before the deal is signed, which is expected in November. In a statement to the Post, Russell said he was looking forward to seeing Forbes realize a new vision for capitalism, where companies create both economic value and value for the world at the same time. Last month, as the Post talked with Russell's representatives, a new company, created by Russell to make the Forbes purchase, sent out a press release saying the $800 million transaction already had attracted over $2 billion of demand, mostly from American investors. The release named 8 of the investors, including the celebrities Tony Robbins and Kevin Hart. It noted that there were no Chinese or Russian investors in the deal. But how much money they or anyone else, including Russell, would be investing was still undecided, according to the release, which noted final investor allocations would be decided in the coming weeks. And written communications, seen by the Post, appeared to show that in the days after the press release Russell's team was still seeking to raise substantial amounts of financing. A spokesperson for Russell told the Post that although all capital required to complete the Forbes acquisition was contractually committed when the deal was signed in May, Russell's team had continued to attract and engage with interested top-tier investors to expand the investor base. Representatives for Russell declined to comment on whether Kemka, the close Musov associate, is an investor in the proposed deal. Sun Group, the Indian conglomerate where Kemka serves as vice chairman, had originally been slated as the lead investor in an earlier version of the sale, according to a January financial document seen by the Post. But after U.S. lawmakers voiced concerns over Kemka's perceived ties to the Kremlin, Russell took over as the head of the deal. Sun Group had initially agreed to provide about half the financing for the purchase, according to 2 of the people familiar with the deal. In their August letter to Yellen, Cotton and Rubio alleged outright that Musov had partnered with Kemka to acquire the publication. Sun Group has partnered with Magomed Musov, a former Kremlin propagandist, to acquire Forbes, the senators said. The senators did not provide any evidence for that assertion. Kemka lived in Russia for 25 years, according to public records, working with the Kremlin on pet projects such as the Skolkovo Business School just outside Moscow, and serving for more than 4 years on the board of a key company within Russia's state arms conglomerate Rostec, including after the United States imposed sanctions on it. He also developed a close relationship with Musov, according to Cherkashin and 3 of the people familiar with the deal, and the 2 men were often seen together at social events and business gatherings. Russell's representatives disputed assertions by several people familiar with the deal that Kemka's daughters, who are U.S. residents, had been forwarded as investors in an attempt to bypass concerns over foreign involvement in the deal. They insisted there was no connection in this deal between Musov and Kemka. Kemka did not respond to a request for comment, while one of Kemka's daughters, Gayatri, 23, reached by the Post, said she was not allowed to comment on the sale. Ever since the deal was announced in May, Russell has touted the acquisition as returning Forbes from its Hong Kong ownership to the United States, asserting that he would have 82% control of the media group's voting rights, meaning that he would have the final say in major corporate decisions. In the audio recordings, however, Musov described the Forbes acquisition as a chance to grow his, and Russia's, global standing, but did not want any attention to his role. The main aim is silence and results, he said in one recording. Muzov insisted in the interview that he had not discussed the deal with any Russian officials, claiming he has not visited Russia for 2 or 3 years. Nor, he said, had he spoken to any Russian officials during that time. But Muzov forged his career with the help of the connections of his father-in-law, a powerful former leader of Dagestan, a Russian republic, who was appointed by Russian President Vladimir Putin. Muzov's father-in-law until recently served as a special Russian envoy to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Muzov had previously served in the Moscow city government, running a major exhibition center before becoming the senior city official for innovation. According to Cherkashin, Muzov had entered the close circle of a powerful Kremlin-connected billionaire, Suleiman Karimov, also from Dagestan, through his father-in-law. When Muzov's company Global Venture Alliance made the $20 million seed investment in 2016 in Russell's Luminar, it did so on behalf of a company controlled by Karimov, Delaware court documents show. The stake in Luminar still held by Muzov's GVA is now frozen by the U.S. Treasury because of U.S. sanctions later imposed against Karimov, according to court documents from July 2023. While that deal became a springboard to other investments in Silicon Valley, it was also the moment when Muzov and Russell became friends, according to Cherkashin, noting it was the first big injection of capital that Russell, then 21, had received. 2 years later, in 2018, Muzov acquired the rights to publish Forbes Russia. A former senior employee noted that Muzov could not operate Forbes Russia without the Kremlin's approval. It is impossible nowadays for there to be a situation where the media does not communicate with Kremlin structures, according to this former employee who spoke on the condition of anonymity for fear of retribution. Otherwise, the ownership of the media has to be changed. Ever since Muzov acquired Forbes Russia, he began cultivating a relationship with the current owner of Forbes Media Group, TC Yam, eyeing the possibility of acquiring the global brand, according to Cherkashin, as well as an associate of Yam and an associate of Muzov. Muzov had this dream to buy Forbes for a long time, Cherkashin said. Sarah Ellison contributed to this report.